Skalpel. Podcast Gumet.
Hello everyone, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this week's episode of Scalpel Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Robinem Irelandem, an expert in public health and sports marketing. Dr. Irelandem, if you could introduce yourself to our listeners who might not know you as well.
Hi, well, it's really nice to be on this. I'm an honorary research fellow at the School of Health and Wellbeing in the University of Glasgow. I'm also the director of research for the Health Equalities Group, and which involves Healthy Stadia, which is work I've been doing for a number of years now.
Okay, and can you tell us what your research is about?
I felt that in public health, you have to consider culture. You have to consider, if you want people to be able to have healthier lives, you need to look at how culture affects and changes people. I was living in Merseyside, from the 1980s onwards. And on Merseyside, people will probably be aware that football clubs like Liverpool and Everton are absolutely huge. So if you want to start helping people to think more about health and healthy environments, it made sense to me that you started to think about sport. So in about 2007, we developed a movement called Healthy Stadia, which was looking at how sport could be used to promote health. And almost really from that time on, so we're talking 18 years now, I've been doing research about, unfortunately, whereas sport is a very healthy activity, I love sport, I do lots of sport, I'm really conscious that it's used very often, or the marketing of sport, to sell us what's bad for us. In the old days, it was tobacco. Today, it's gambling, it's sugary drinks, it's junk food, and it's alcohol. That doesn't seem to be right. Why are we allowing our sport, which should be a really positive thing, particularly for young people, why are we allowing it to be used that way? So that's really one way of describing the work I've been doing and keeping me going, and probably will keep me going for many years later, around sport and health, basically.
Okay, so you're focusing on the advertisement in the sports industry, let's say, not maybe not community. So what are the trends that you're seeing in the advertisement, and why would you even consider researching it further? Because we just know how advertisement in general works. Why research it further?
I think we need to understand exactly more how it actually does work. And I think we've allowed our sport to develop a commercial model which has made it more or less dependent on that kind of income. And I actually think that's inappropriate. I think it's very interesting to look at the history of sports sponsorship. Modern sports sponsorship really began in the 1960s and the 1970s with tobacco sponsorship, which clearly is long gone, thank goodness. But tobacco advertising was part of the marketing used by those companies to particularly encourage young people to start smoking. And of course, with smoking, it's fairly easy to describe in one sense. It's addictive. If you can get young people started, you may have got them for life. It's as cynical as that. And that's really what tobacco advertising was like. What is quite disturbing, and I can see those trends now, on British television, tobacco advertising was banned from 1965, much earlier than we thought. We already knew that tobacco was dreadful for us from the late 1950s and the 1960s. We didn't have tobacco advertising, despite what I just said. You couldn't have tobacco advertising on television. We didn't get rid of tobacco advertising on our screens because it was allowed to be in sport. And so tobacco advertising, in other words, you saw Formula One cars driving around in the livery of Marlboro Tobacco as one company, red and white. That continued remarkably until 2007. So it's quite recent in one sense. So what you see is when we put regulation in place for health reasons to protect the health, particularly of our young people, the companies will often find ways to avoid that regulation, and they'll use sport as a medium to do that. So in the last century, basically, we're talking tobacco advertising. Now we have different trends in advertising. So we still have alcohol advertising, of course, We have a lot of energy drink advertising. We have vaping advertising, and particularly pernicious in recent times gambling advertising. So in the United Kingdom, we had a Gambling Act in 2005, and that completely changed the way gambling advertising was perceived in sport. And of course now, and I'm sure the same in Poland, I mean, the iPhone was invented in 2007. We now all carry around smartphones where you can bet 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now that's very different. And a lot of the marketing around gambling in sport is aimed at young people. So things have changed over the years, but the approach is target young people. It's still the same, I would argue.
And when you think of it, would you say that the threats that we have now with the gambling and alcohol and the processed food and sugary drinks, are those ads now bigger threats, especially to young people, than the previous set of ads that was heavily relying on the promotion of the tobacco use? Or-
Okay, yeah, I totally get the question. Two things have changed from the when I talked about the early days tobacco advertising. One is the fact that we may have access sometimes all the time to maybe 3 screens even at the same time. So a lot of people, for instance, will go and watch football in a bar. They'll have their phone, they might have their laptop, and they might have the TV screen in front of them. The channels are so much more varied, particularly with social media. So I'm aware that a lot of the advertising that is now aimed at young people, I don't see because I'm not the market. I don't use TikTok, for example. And that's where a lot of these advertisements are, but it's also the audience. So the English Premier League back in 1992 was probably largely watched by people who went to matches like me in England and went in person. It's now a global entertainment product, and it's sold on the basis of the advertising that accompanies the TV. So the sponsorship, there's commercial income. So the audience is in the millions, and I remember the figure because it's another presentation I was giving. I don't know whether it is the latest information, but the English Premier League say that you can watch their matches in 212 different territories across the world, which is remarkable. I say territories, but sometimes they're not defined officially as countries, but it's right across the world. So the biggest audience for the English Premier League is almost certainly in Asia. So the advertising that we see on the company in English Premier League is often not even aimed at an English audience. I mean, it's a totally bizarre concept, but when you start to think about that, so yes, it's worse, but it's much, much more sophisticated. So even when we have controls over some kind of gambling advertising or whatever, we're seeing the English Premier League with logos on the front of shirts, which is actually trying to encourage people to gamble in countries like India and China where it's illegal. I mean, it's used to contravene national law sometimes. We're talking global advertising. So yes, it's worse on that basis. It's quite scary when you start looking at it like that.
Okay, so I am now interested because you said they advertise this way in the countries that the gambling is illegal. Is it like, is there a way they then profit from it if it's illegal in these countries, or is it just like the proxy of what they're doing?
As you know, people now can find very easy ways of getting onto their phone or onto their computer, which identifies their location in other countries. So even when it's illegal in your country, you can use VPN connections to show that theoretically you're betting from another country. So the sophistication now of technology enables you. We're focusing on gambling, but there's plenty of other products and things that would concern me. But gambling is quite interesting because of the changes in technology in the past few years, which have had a direct effect. So in days gone by, it would be predominantly men would probably turn up at a betting shop on the high street. That isn't the main means of gambling now. It's on your phone. So it's completely linked to technology. So that's. I'm also aware that there are also. I mean, I don't e-game, for instance. We now find that e-games is a big marketing medium for energy drinks, products like that, because it's aimed very specifically at young people. So again, what I'm very conscious of with sport and people my age, aren't always aware of it, because as I say, we're not the market. It's right, and sport has always had that. Sport is exciting, it's glamorous, it's passionate, it's unpredictable. The biggest audience is always young people, often young men actually, although much more women, of course, now do follow it. But the audience has always been traditionally young men over long periods. So in days gone by, quite innocently, and you still have this, you'll have shaving products being advertised, male fragrance. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Why not? But of course, it's also because young men are often seen as risk takers. So there'll be products linked with that, whether it's alcohol, whether in tobacco in the day gone by, whether it's energy drinks. So it's appealing to that aspect of an audience, I suppose. So it's a very sophisticated game. But to repeat, I guess, where we started the discussion from, ethically, I find it quite upsetting that sport is used in that way, and we've allowed it to be, because it is a lot worse than it was. Simply, not only because of social media and those kind of mechanisms, it's just we've allowed every aspect of both a stadium or the players or the fans to be promoting every single square inch of our body or the pitch or the stadium has got some kind of advertising thing on. It's ridiculous. You go back and look at old pictures and you might find an image on a stand or something like that. And somehow, of course, to young people, they're going, oh, because it's always been like that. But it wasn't. It wasn't like that. So we've allowed it to happen. And where do we draw the line? It's ridiculous.
I have no idea where we draw the line. I don't think there is a line to be drawn right now. But something that you said made me wonder, because you have mentioned that more women now attend these events. And do you feel like there's a difference in of course, there's a difference in the advertising towards women, but do you feel like there's a difference in what they advertise during the female teams events versus male teams events? And also, do you think that they include more ads directed towards women right now in the predominantly male sports events? Because I don't think women respond to that smoking or drinking or gambling in the same way that men would, right? And they are, of course, they're users of all of these, but they're probably not as good of an audience for the companies to reach to. Something that you said made me wonder, because you have mentioned that more women now attend these events. And do you feel like there's a difference in of course, there's a difference in the advertising towards women, but do you feel like there's a difference in what they advertise during the female teams events versus male teams events? And also, do you think that they include more ads directed towards women right now in the predominantly male sports events? Because I don't think women respond to that smoking or drinking or gambling in the same way that men would, right? And they are, of course, they're users of all of these, but they're probably not as good of an audience for the companies to reach to.
There were a few questions in there, I think. I think, and it would be different, I suspect, according to what we were talking about. So, yeah, I certainly understand that women may well respond to marketing in different ways. So I don't think sport is as big a vehicle for women. Say responses to gambling might well be lottery advertisements, for instance, or product placement within television programs. So that might be quite different, for example. But I think as women's sport has got more, the key you see is a television audience. So England have very specific, because in the United Kingdom there are English teams, Scottish teams, Welsh teams, and so on. So the English women's football team is incredibly successful, as in the England women's rugby team. So they're commercially viable. They attract sponsors. So once that happens and the market becomes bigger, I suspect you will see more advertising spend there. In answer to your question, the products can be a wee bit different and can be in exactly the same way, I think, in terms of male grooming. You would see the equivalent for female fashion, I would expect. But we're also seeing things like energy drinks enter that marketplace as well. And I think the more popular it is, we'll see more of that. I think in terms of men's football, there's probably more consideration now of families, but that's not necessarily a good thing because again, it's aimed at the young people that go. So I think what people sometimes don't perhaps perceive quite is how much sport itself is a we talked about culture before. It's a reflection of socio-economic structure, the same as everything else. It's integrally part of society, and it always makes me smile. People in sport often say, well, sport isn't political. Of course it is. It's just part of society. So decisions made in sport reflect society as a whole. So if we're becoming more liberal in how we've seen gambling, you'll see it reflected in sport in exactly the same way. Now, when you start looking at ethics, there are certain things that you don't tend to see allowed on the front of shirts, but generally speaking, it's sport that's come to that decision rather than society. It's quite interesting. So, for instance, I mean, totally amazingly, there was a German team that had a weapons manufacturer as a sponsor of one of their teams, which I find quite amazing and rather surprising and frankly quietly disturbing. So you do see different changes. But for example, in the English league and certainly in Spanish and Italian, I'm trying to remember, but the English league, you won't be allowed to have a gambling brand on the front of shirts from next season, but it's just the English Premier League. But in that, there is a recognition that's inappropriate. But what is quite strange, again, it just shows you sometimes how, well, for want of an unscientific word, how silly these things sometimes are. Because with gambling, even now, with football teams in England, you're not allowed to put a gambling brand on a replica shirt that is of children's size. But of course, it's how big's a child? So you can see an 11-year-old who's big for his age walking around with a gambling brand on because he can fit an adult shirt. So it's clearly farcical when you go.
Yeah,
We've also had the odd footballer who's turned out very young for the Premier League side, who's 15, and he's not allowed to wear the official men's top shirt, but he's too young. So you can see some of the contradictions and the difficulties when we go into it in detail.
Yeah, but I don't think it really matters because even if the kid cannot wear this shirt, still the parent can. So if the son is going to the game with his father, he's still seeing this advertising on his father's shirt. So
Absolutely.
this
And
doesn't really make he's just as exposed, or maybe more, because like he won't probably look at his own shirt, but he will definitely look at his parents, right? But I also wondered from the public health perspective. Right now we are going into like the more conscious choices that we have. So we have banned smoking both in public places, mainly in Poland, but I suspect in the UK it's a similar situation. So we have banned public smoking, and we are also having a growing interest in non-alcoholic beverages like the 0% beer and the alternatives for that. And we also have all of these, because you've mentioned the sugary drinks like the Red Bull ads, like the energy drinks. So a lot of energy drinks are also now sugar free, quote unquote. So like they have the processed versions of sugar, but not the sugar, the simple sugar. So do you see from the public health perspective that this is going in the right direction and these ads are more, let's say, more pushed right now? Like they advertising more 0% beer in sports right now, because sports is generally connected with the healthy lifestyle. So are the healthier choices now advertised within the games?
again, that's a complicated. Let's focus upon alcohol for a minute. And I'm not a prohibitionist. I'm not into banning. I'm not into banning gambling. I'm not into banning alcohol. What concerns me is the type of promotion and marketing. And generally speaking, an alcohol company is in business, or a gambling company is in business to sell as much product as possible. And I'm not criticizing them for that. That's what they have to serve their shareholders. That's what they're in business for. I don't think looking at alcohol, it really bothers them in the slightest bit whether they're selling full strength alcohol or low alcohol. With a public health perspective, I prefer people to drink more low alcohol. But the advertising you see it's now predominantly low alcohol, but I will be completely cynical here, and this is because alcohol companies realise that by doing that, they're going to avoid regulation, because it's very hard to say we can't stop low brand alcohol. But you'll see that the branding, the colours, the image used is exactly the same. So for the perception of the consumer, what they're going to see is a particular colourway or a particular slogan, and they'll associate it with the same product. So, for example, and I'm going to talk about junk food for a moment, in the UK, McDonald's sponsor a lot of soccer camps. You don't actually even use the name of their company. We know that the arch and the yellow and red we immediately associate with McDonald's.
Absolutely.
They don't actually even need to have their name put in full, and we see that exactly the same as alcohol. So, for instance, in a football tournament, European football tournament in France, not that long ago, there's a national law against marketing of alcohol products in sport. They just use the same colorway and the same slogans. So, unfortunately, hardly surprisingly, and if you look at the history of tobacco, where we were talking about before, a company, they have some very creative minds, don't they? They find, and they want to sell the product. They'll find a way around the regulation. So when you see low alcohol, yeah, I'm fine. I'd rather people drank more of it. But let's be clear, the marketing is the marketing of the brand. It's in the marketing of the company. It's not specific low alcohol. It just appears that. But what's happening in the UK now, for instance, we're having a ban on advertising of food and drink, which is high fat, sugar, and salt, from January next year. It's been delayed about 3 or 4 years, and it's particularly about product. It's not about brand. So we'll see a shift, but it'll still be the brand that's being promoted. I would be quite critical of that from a public health perspective.
Okay, so they will now focus more on promoting the brands and not the specific products that might contain sugar or salt.
Yeah. So for instance, and I'm mentioning McDonald's just because everybody's heard of McDonald's, but let's be honest, I think we could probably agree that generally speaking, people don't go into a McDonald's to buy a salad.
Yeah.
They'll go in to buy a burger or something like that. So, but the advertising then of McDonald's in the future in the channels that I'm talking about will undoubtedly be things like salad, which great, it's salad, but really you'll still see, and that isn't why people go there. We know that isn't why they go there.
Okay, so there are definitely two more questions that I want to clock in, and I know that we are coming short on time. So one of them is, why do you think, there are so many rich brands that are promoting healthy food and healthy habits, and that people could actually benefit from seeing that and getting familiarized through the marketing strategies, like through the games and so on? Why do you think the sports world actually is still preferring to get the advertisement from the tobacco and gambling and so on companies, instead of turning to these health promoting companies that would both be great from ethical point of view, and I think could still bring them money?
Well, I think it is an important point. I think when there have been bans of some kind of advertising, so obviously, I mean, a great example is Formula One motor racing, which had huge amounts of income from tobacco, and said the motor racing would collapse if tobacco advertising went. Didn't, did it? It's doing pretty well. It's global product exactly the same. So they will find other places, I think. But when you're producing something unhealthy, you will probably pay more money to get out into that marketplace. Your role is to make your brand stand out. Sport is a very convenient place to do it. And they make an awful lot of money in ultra processed food. They make an awful lot of money in alcohol. For a certain point, it's cheap investment. I mean, if you look at Budweiser as an alcohol company, they built their entire history on marketing a sport, I would argue, in exactly the same way as Coca-Cola have been. I mean, remarkably, I talked about modern sports sponsorship. Coca-Cola have been involved with the Olympics since 1928. There's a long history. They know what they're doing. They're clever. So yeah, they put the money in because they know they'll make the profit down the line.
Okay, so they are basically just 1 foot in, so it's easier to keep cooperating with the companies that and that the people are responding well to. than to switch to the whole
Yeah.
new set.
I think that's quite a fair way of putting it. I've talked to commercial managers and English Premier League teams in my time. And of course, if a gambling company is offering you £3 million to go on the front of your shirt and you haven't got to take time to try and find somebody else, you're probably going to take it, aren't you? It's a lot of money. It's easier. And unfortunately, this is the balance that we all have to play in sport, isn't it? We want sport to happen, but where do we cross? You said there isn't a line to cross. I think there probably is a line to cross, but that's a discussion between clubs, between fans, but also it should be parents. It should be parents say, I don't want my kid to go to a ground or watch something on television that persuading her or him to gamble or have sugary drinks or energy drinks which are inappropriate for them. So there is a role we can play as communities, as parents. We can get change.
Okay, so you think that the public perspective can influence the sports team not to take these deals with the brands that are basically not doing any good for their children's health?
I think it's very difficult, but there are examples of that. And there are, it's not an easy discussion because if you run a business, they'll tell you they want to get all the money and they can, but there's a cost to society, isn't it? If making their business successful is creating ill health for us in communities, we should be holding them to account. So I'm not saying it's easy, but the example of tobacco, of course, if you work in public health, you worked in it as long as me, we've seen the changes within tobacco. So it can happen across other industries and we can see sport change in a positive way.
Okay, and do you see like when it comes to tobacco, do you see a lot of advertisements, for example, for vaping, which is right now very modern, very hip with children? And and do you see that they switched to this part, or is tobacco completely like out of the discussion for the sport?
I've answered a few questions and I said, oh, that's a complicated question. And I'm going to go, oh, that's a complicated question. But I would say that vaping companies are often now run by tobacco companies. They're using the same techniques. I mean, I will say straight off that cigarettes are worse for your health than vapes. But you described them as being cool and hip. Well, that doesn't happen automatically. That's because, again, of the type of marketing. And I always remember walking down a street in Manchester with a colleague who'd come to visit me, and she lives in Switzerland. She was walking down the street and she said, look at that shop. And there was a vaping shop there. There was a picture of a young woman in the image with a kind of, and forgive me, I have no idea whether an Audrey Hepburn image is that obviously
Yeah.
So the glam, the very attractive young woman using a cigarette as a sort of, it's a lot of imagery, isn't it? There's glamour, there's fashion, there's style. The vaping's done exactly the same thing, so it hasn't happened overnight. The colours, the flavours. It's aimed at kids, I'm sorry. And of course, it's been very, very effective. And we probably have a new public health issue because of that, not just the smoking of them, or using them, should I say, which we don't know the long-term effects of, but there's an environmental aspect to this as well, and disposing of them and so on. So it's a big issue. I think marketing has always been, it's very creative, it's very imaginative. We often enjoy it, it's often fun, but we need to be aware that it's encouraging us to consume, and sometimes the consumption comes at quite serious costs.
Okay, so in terms of awareness that we have right now, can you tell me, is there any way that we can raise people's awareness to protect them from the influence of these marketing strategies? Do you have any tips that would help people recognize and not to get caught within this machinery and get influenced by the things that I don't think they inherently want to be influenced by? They simply are exposed to the perfectly designed manipulation machinery. Well, maybe not exposure, but the way it's like.
I think if you're a parent, you will be aware of it and you'll be concerned about it and you'll be aware that you have very little control over it, if the truth be known. So I don't think it matters, frankly, however much we try and make ourselves aware of it. We're all exposed to it. I feel there needs to be, in public health terms, we consider it upstream. We look at the causes for it to see what we can do. The problem we have with unhealthy commodity industries is they blame us for responding to their messages. So it's your fault if you eat too much. It's your fault if you drink too much. It's your fault if you gamble too much. You should have more self-awareness, more self-control. But all we're doing is responding to all the cues to do that. So if we're really going to have some kind of impact, we need to look at those cues and try and slow them down, try and stop them, try and protect our children. Otherwise, we're in this never-ending circle. So I think it is very difficult because the companies will frame it as all about individual responsibility when they're doing their utmost to make sure that whatever we do, we're going to end up doing the wrong things, I suppose, is one way of putting it.
Okay, so basically there's not much we can do to like avoid this exposure. And
Well, I'll give you an example. No, I mean, we all like to think we do, and we can, because I mean, we do have a voice, as I say. Particularly, we talked about sport, and we talked predominantly about professional sport. In community sport, you certainly have. So you know, if your local clubhouse has got an alcohol brand all over it, you can complain about it, and it's quite possible then get something else in. If the vending machine inside is only energy drinks, you can say, well, hang on a minute, you'll still make money if you have a healthier drink. So yes, you can do things. So I don't want to sound incredibly negative and pessimistic about it all, but I'm just being realistic, and we're really going to have change. It has to be more upstream. So, but yeah, I mean, as you won't be surprised, complain all the time about the advertising and marketing too, and I'd encourage other people to do it and to question where the income comes from, because as you said, it was an interesting comment. You know, sometimes people go for the easier option. The easier options, yeah, I mean, particularly in sport, if a gambling company or an alcohol company, people don't question it. Well, we should be questioning it. Why aren't we questioning it?
Okay, and do you think like the policymakers are doing what they can? Like in Poland, we are now implementing some prohibition, like in much more city. Like for example, in Gdańsk, you right now cannot buy alcohol in the shops and the gas station and so on after 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning.
Interesting.
Yes, so this is the new law that we have, and more cities are going into it. Gdańsk wasn't also first city to implement prohibition or partial prohibition, let's say. And of course, you can still buy alcohol in restaurants or in pubs, but you cannot go to the street and just buy it on the street. So do you think the policymakers can actually influence this further?
Yes, no, I do. And it's really interesting to hear that. And of course, you have national level, but you do also have municipalities. So municipalities can take their own decisions very often. I think that's a very positive approach. So what's starting to be quite common, particularly in England, is local healthier advertising and sponsorship policies. So advertisements for junk food are sort of banned on anything controlled by the municipality. So it could be billboards, could be bus advertising. This happened in London, I think, so maybe 2017. Can't quite remember. So Transport for London. So if anybody listening goes to London and goes on the tube and goes on the underground, you'll see as you go up the escalator, the advertising is not junk food. You might see a McDonald's salad advert, but you won't see a McDonald's burger advert.
Okay, so we are doing something in that direction.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for this incredibly eye-opening discussion. I hope it will help our listeners recognize some patterns in modern sport marketing and maybe protect themselves from the unwanted influences of it. To everyone listening, thank you for tuning in for this episode of Scalpel Podcast Gumet. My guest was Dr. Robinem Irelandem, and my name is Izabela Żarczyńska, and it was a pleasure to host this episode for you.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.